How did the Roberts Court come up with the idea that we live in a post-racial society and everything that was established in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act doesn't need to be applied any longer? Those are the questions that we're going to tackle in this conversation, which is part of a series that details how the Calais decision that recently passed and gutted the Voting Rights Act is actually just one in a long line of conservative and Republican efforts to return us back to an era where they say America was great. And that era where America was great was one where rich, white, wealthy men controlled everything, and the rest of us were just cannon fodder. In this conversation, we're going to cover the evolution of the courts and how the Republican takeover of the courts has led to what we see today in terms of judicial decisioning with respect to the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and what that actually means for us as everyday Americans. And if you haven't already done so, make sure you check out the previous episodes and drop me a follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any future episodes of Left in Exile. So when we look at the Roberts Court and the decisions that they've made, what were the foundations that they were built upon? If you want to answer those questions, that process started in the 80s working forward. The court narrowed Section 2 towards the pre-1982 standard, making intent the key issue again. So if you want to bring a civil rights claim, you have to prove intent and race-based intent in order to get heard. And that's how the game works now. They make it harder for you to prove discrimination, and they say that no discrimination exists. The civil rights era was a long time ago. We're in a post-racial society. Because one black guy got elected, we are now magically in a post-racial society, and none of this matters. This is them burying the body and demanding a missing persons report signed by the murderer. And when you dig into the details, Sam Alito's opinion is even worse than that. Alito gives Republican legislatures a roadmap for returning their states back to the Confederate era, Jim Crow era South, or worse. He says, just don't say race, say party. It's totally fine for you to gerrymander based on political and party considerations. Because if black voters tend to vote Democratic, Republican legislatures can claim that they were targeting Democrats, not black voters. And you can apply that down the line to every marginalized community that you see. That's the shell game. Race goes under one cup, party goes under another cup. The court moves the cups around and then tells black voters that they're imagining the whole thing. They're telling women that they're imagining the whole thing. They're telling gay people and trans people that they're imagining all of this. And why does that matter? Because when you look at the Common Cause case, that court already said that they're not going to police partisan gerrymandering. So now you have a 1-2 punch. Between the Calais case and the Common Cause case, you have the playbook for the Neo-Confederacy, the Republican Party, to execute gerrymandering at will and institute permanent white male majority rule. What this is racial discrimination that's being laundered. It's being laundered as partisan gerrymandering, and then the court has created the permission slip in the playbook for Republican-controlled states to destroy minority voting power and call it politics. That's how you usher in a white Christian nationalist ethno-state. That is the design. That's minority rule with a lifetime appointment stapled to the front. And the irony of all of this is that the constitutional interpretation that the Roberts Court would like to have you believe is that discrimination on the basis of race is permitted, but fixing discrimination on the basis of race is not. This is the typical type of convoluted gaslighting logic that you expect from MAGA. But then again, this is a court that is a MAGA court. And it's no surprise that MAGA draws its tagline from the KKK, and it's no surprise that this court is using the same reasoning and logic that the states that founded the KKK adhered to when they exterminated black people at will and chased them away from the polls. This has been the goal of the conservative project since the passage of the Civil War amendments. And what this means is that it's bringing to the forefront the underlying principles that's driven the Republican Party since the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. The Neo-Confederacy, the Republican Party, has been making the argument that the Reconstruction amendments themselves are illegitimate.
Gives us a chance in all of them if we get some reprieve from the courts, and so we'll see how that goes, and certainly hope that the Supreme Court will overturn Amendment 14 and gives us a shot to revisit those.
What would you say from your perspective? I mean, other than Mr. Pro Tem, everyone was relatively silent on the goings-ons. What would you say from your perspective is the biggest misconception about what the bills do, and a message that you'd like to see out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest misconception is, the thing about it is, people tend to forget what happened when this thing went to court before. We actually, the Republican Party had that seat in, in Mobile. It's number 2 seat, that's the congressional seat 2, so the district 2, and so that was one of the things. There's been a push through the courts to try to overtake some of these red state seats, and that's certainly what happened in that one. And with the ruling that happened in Louisiana, we felt like it gave us a chance to maybe regain that seat, but also open up District 7. So I think that's happened. All we need now is the courts to overturn 14, and we can look at a new election.
And when you look at how conservatives attacked those amendments and later amendments, conservatives were the ones that attacked Brown versus Board of Education. Conservatives are the ones that are attacking the Voting Rights Act. They're the ones who have been making the case that the Reconstruction era amendments and everything after that has been a betrayal of originalist constitutional principles. That's the through line that you need to understand. These conservatives, these neo-Confederates of today, they don't want the Constitution that came after the Civil War. They want the Constitution that occurred before the Civil War. The one where rights are narrow, citizenship is narrow, voting is narrow, power is narrow, and white men ran the place. So when you hear originalism, understand what the meaning is. What originalism means from their perspective is that the courts exist and the Constitution exists to insulate white power. And when you understand that that's the goal, you also understand who isn't included in that calculation. Black people aren't, women aren't, indigenous people aren't, workers aren't. None of those people deserve political power. That's the architecture. You're choosing a starting point. You're choosing a jurisprudence where most of the country was excluded. And when you understand all of this, you understand that the legal reasoning that the court is applying today is the same legal reasoning that existed in the antebellum era, before the Reconstruction amendments. That era didn't guarantee equal protection. It didn't protect voting rights. It didn't outlaw discrimination. It protected the rights of some men to own other men as property. That is the worldview that today's Republican Party wants to return to. And they won't say any of these things outright. They won't say slavery. They'll say states' rights. They won't say Jim Crow. They'll say election integrity. They won't say white rule. They'll say colorblindness. They won't say corporate oligarchy. They'll say free enterprise. And all of that points to the same era and the same type of society. It points to an era in society where there are a small number of dominators and the rest of us are dominated. And that's where the Powell memo connects to the Roberts Court. Powell's memo said business needed to organize across education, media, politics, and law. Powell's business cases notes that the business roundtable that formed in 1972 followed right-wing foundations and think tanks and legal groups. The Federalist Society, Cato, Heritage Foundation, Pacific Legal Foundation, Chambers National Litigation Center. All of those came after the Powell memo. That's the machine that got us to here today. That was the infrastructure. It wasn't one bad judge, one bad election. It wasn't one bad president. It was a 50-year project, an institutional siege, and the Republican Party became the political vehicle for that siege. They used corporate money to build the courts. They used courts to protect corporate money. They used corporate money to build the media. They used the media to radicalize and racialize voters. They used radicalized voters to win state power. They used state power to suppress votes. Then they suppress votes to hold federal power. And then they used federal power to stack the court. And the court turned around and called the whole thing constitutional. That's the racket that they ran. And we are stuck right in the middle of it. And when you look at how we got stuck, That's where identity and culture wars comes in. Because the culture war isn't a distraction from the economic project. It's the fuel source. See, Powell saw civil rights, consumer protection, students, media, and social reformers as threats to corporate power. Modern Republicans took that fear and turned it into a mass politics of resentment. They tell white workers that black voters are stealing power. They tell men that women are stealing jobs. They tell straight people that the LGBTQIA plus community are stealing culture. They tell Christians that pluralism is persecution. They tell citizens that immigrants are stealing the country. And while everybody is angry at everybody else, the billionaire class walks out the door with the treasury. That is by design. It's not an accident. That's how this hierarchy survives. In a country where the majority would benefit from solidarity, you break everybody up into tiny little pieces and get them mad at each other so that you can rob them blind. That is what Powell set in motion. That is what Republicans enable, all to the benefit of the billionaire and millionaire class. You make workers hate each other. You make poor white people think that their boss is their friend and their black neighbor is the threat. You make men think feminism caused their problems, not wage theft, not union busting, not healthcare costs, not housing costs and corporate greed. You make people terrified of being replaced and replace their wages with debt, their schools with propaganda, and their votes with gerrymanders. That's the Republican game. And it's been that game since the Reconstruction era, and the new foundation was put into place the day that the Voting Rights Act passed and Nixon thought up the Southern strategy. And conservatives have been fighting against Reconstruction and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act every step of the way. After Reconstruction, it was conservatives that helped pave the way for Jim Crow. What conservatives did is that they gave the rights that were meant for the emancipated to corporations instead. It allowed states to disenfranchise black voters through supposed colorblind means. It permitted racial discrimination by government and private actors. And that was the first version of their trick. They took rights won through black struggle and then handed them to corporations. Then they tell black people the Constitution has nothing left for them. And now we're watching the second iteration of that. The Roberts Court has been on a decade-long jihad against voting rights, and particularly black voting rights. Corporate power continues to expand while individuals are living paycheck to paycheck in an era of record profits. Republican legislatures draw maps where voters can't remove them, and then the same party that screams about freedom while building a system where fewer and fewer people have actual power over their own lives. Freedom for the Republican Party means domination, and domination is the song that the billionaire class wants to sing because they don't see us as people. They see us as fuel that's designed to be spent and disposed of. Freedom never means anything for the workers. Freedom for workers, negotiate with your landlord. Freedom for women, bleed out in the parking lot. Freedom for black voters, sue after the election is stolen. Freedom for immigrants, carry papers and hope the masked agents believe you, or roll dice and see if you make it out of the gulags that they've been constructing since they gained power. Freedom for corporations, though, spend unlimited money and call it speech. That's the Constitution of the Republican Party. That's the Constitution of the billionaire class and the millionaire class. That is the republic. That is the first republic that they want. So when they tell you a republic and a democracy are two different things, in their minds, it is. And that's how it's architected. So if you're sitting here thinking that this is an attack on everything that we see out there, it is an attack on everything. Why do you think they're going after birthright citizenship? Because the birthright citizenship was written into the 14th Amendment to overturn Dred Scott's conclusion that black people could never be citizens. When I say they want to return back to the First Republic, they want to return back to an era where people could own people. And guess what sort of people can get owned? So when Trump is attacking birthright citizenship, it's not a side issue. All of his handlers are wanting this enacted. That's a direct attack on one of the core achievements of Reconstruction, and the billionaire class wants to see to it that those who have the gold are free to dispose of anyone who doesn't and use them as they see fit. That's the attack on the idea that citizenship is not a racial inheritance. The reason why billionaires want this to happen is because they want to do away with the idea that the state can't create a hereditary underclass inside the United States. The billionaire capitalist wet dream dictates that you need a permanent underclass to exploit. That's why they're going hard at this. That's why they want that old order back, because they cannot survive without that permanent underclass. All of the billionaire parasites and their dark enlightenment talk is all about returning to a country where some people have rights and some people have conditional rights and some people have status as never having status. That is the logic of the First Republic that filters through Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Mark Zuckerberg, and every other billionaire parasite that you see today. They see themselves as the masters, and they see the rest of us as property. So don't miss the outcome of all of this. They want to restrict black freedom because it allows for the same things that happened when black freedom was revoked after Reconstruction. It doesn't create prosperity except for the billionaire class. Because what happened when black freedom was squashed in the post-Reconstruction era, it created the Gilded Age, a society where the upper classes gained massive wealth. Economic crises devastated millions of people. Workers were divided by race and class so that they couldn't challenge the rich. And that's the part that all of us need to understand. The billionaire class and white supremacy aren't just morally evil. What they're doing is not just moral evil. It's the economy weaponized against the citizenry to break the will of everybody else so that they accept the bare minimum as long as someone else is lower. It convinces people to accept bad schools as long as someone else is blamed. It convinces people to accept no healthcare, no stability, no bargain power, no future, as long as they get the psychological wage of being above someone else. That's the con. That's how the billionaire and millionaire class stay where they are, and the rest of us live paycheck to paycheck because we are spending all of our time pointing the finger at somebody else who is the reason for why we are where we are, instead of going after these billionaire parasites and making sure that they no longer get a moment's peace. And this is what the Republicans have perfected. So when you see what the Roberts Court did in gutting the Voting Rights Act, this isn't just about voting. This is a gateway. If they can take away the vote of black people, they can do that to everyone else, and they can do that to everything else. They can confiscate your wages, your schools, your water, your roads, your healthcare, your bodily autonomy, your workplace protections, and your ability to live without state violence. Isn't it interesting how you see all of these billionaires pushing their data centers into all sorts of communities that are going to basically make those communities unlivable? And there's no protection for the people, but there's protection for the billionaire class and their data centers. That's why they're attacking the vote. And even as far back as 1865, Frederick Douglass understood this. He understood that without access to the ballot as a means of self-defense, liberty doesn't exist for the rest of us. It only exists for the billionaire class. That's why they're attacking the vote, because democracy is the tool, the one tool that the ordinary person can use to put a leash on power. And Republicans and their billionaire overlords don't want a leash. They want power to be unleashed. They want power to be unleashed on workers, on black voters, on immigrants, on women, on queer and trans people, on anyone that's not aligned with their racial, religious, or corporate order. And this is where we need to be clear. This is not a return to the past because Republicans love history. Honestly, most Republicans can't even read. This is a return to the past because the past gives them a model before Reconstruction where rights were narrow, before labor law, bosses had near total control, before civil rights, states could enforce a white nationalist ethno-state, before the modern regulatory state, corporations could poison, exploit, discriminate, and call it business. Before the Voting Rights Act, white political machines could suppress black votes and still call themselves democratic. That's the world that they want updated. They want that same hierarchy with better technology, more surveillance, more money, more courts, more propaganda, and more excuses. That's what they mean when they say, take our country back. And that's why they can never answer the questions when you ask them. Take the country back from who? Take the country back to when? Take the country back to what? And the reason why they don't answer those questions is because the answers to those questions all point to the same ugly crap that they want to hide from you. They want to take it back before Reconstruction, back before civil rights, back before workers had power, back before women had autonomy, back before the federal government could enforce equal citizenship, back to that first republic, back to the owner's republic, back to the slaveholder's imagination with a corporate logo on top of it. So what do we do from here? What can we do from here? The first thing that we need to do is understand that the Calais decision, when it comes to the redistricting in Louisiana, is not the end of this. The ultimate goal for the Republican Party is to return back to the first republic. And what that means for every Democrat going forward is that they need to be principled and disciplined in stating that there is going to be broad legislative and regulatory and business reforms and punishment and accountability for everyone involved in this exercise of returning us back to the era of slave masters and slaves. We need a new Voting Rights Act. And one of the first things that the new Voting Rights Act needs to do is expand the number of people that can be elected into the House. The current construction of the House of Representatives hasn't changed since the early 1900s. We're in 2026. We're long past the era and the population where we need a whole lot of new House districts. And when that law gets passed, we need to make sure that baked into that law is the fact that the courts cannot review the law. And when we're talking about the courts, we need to expand the courts at all levels. And we need to establish term limits for Supreme Court justices. Those term limits need to be no more than 18 years. So now this sort of judicial capture can never happen again. We need to make sure that there's laws in place that dictate that felons and criminals cannot get elected into any elected office, from the local level all the way up to the presidency. We need to make sure that anyone that is running for office, that a law is on the books that says that unless you have complete financial disclosure, you are ineligible to run. We need to get rid of Citizens United. We need to bring in a 95% top marginal tax rate. And that means anybody with wealth and a net worth over $20 million gets taxed at 95% for every dollar over that $20 million. We need to make sure that the corporate tax rates are upwards of 50%. We need to disappear the days where corporations can make billions in profits and give their executive teams multi-million-dollar bonuses while their workers are scraping along with 2-3 jobs barely at minimum wage. We need to understand that when Republicans talk about deregulation, what they're really saying is we want the referees out of the game so we can run every scam that we can think of. Because the bottom line of all of this, and that's not a comprehensive list of things that need to be done. That's just what's top of mind. The bottom line of all of this is not that the court is corrupt. It's not that the Republican Party is authoritarian. It's not that corporate America funded a 50-year legal counter-revolution. The takeaway of all of this is that just because rights exist on paper, those words on paper don't defend themselves. They never have. They require knuckles to get dirty and bloody, and for the people to punch back and demand that their rights be upheld. The Civil War amendments didn't enforce themselves. The Voting Rights Act didn't pass itself. And all of those things are under attack because of voter apathy and the right-wing media ecosystem convincing you that there is no difference between one party or another. Meanwhile, there is definitely one party that's taking the rights away of all the people in this country, except for the rich, white, wealthy elites. What we need to understand is that every right that we have beyond the Bill of Rights was paid for in blood. Labor rights didn't appear because bosses woke up and decided, hey, I'll be a nice guy today. Every inch of what we have today was forced into existence by people who understood that power never gives anything away voluntarily. You have to take it. So whatever action items we come up with, they need to start with the reality that no amount of protests and marches are going to make the wealthy white elite hand over the reins of power. There are no magical courts. There are no savior politicians. There's no fantasy of shame that's going to get these people to do what they need to do, because these people have no shame. What this means is that we need relentless organization, relentless pressure, relentless solidarity, and a willingness to do what is necessary to force these people in power to pay attention and back down or pay and suffer the ultimate consequences. We're already seeing the consequences of Calais come into play. All of the states of the former Confederacy are moving rapidly to redistrict. Louisiana, for example, is stopping their primary elections so they can redraw the maps and consolidate white power. And you see this all across the South. The region of the country that has more black people in it than any other region of the country, those Republican-controlled neo-Confederate states are racing to put back in Jim Crow-era laws. That's what Republicans are doing. They're already coming after birthright citizenship. Watch what the court does with the 14th and 15th Amendment. Watch how colorblindness keeps getting used to protect discrimination and punish remedies. And watch the money. Always watch the money, because behind every one of these moral panics, there's usually a donor looking for a tax cut or a deregulation win or a union busting opportunity in the face of a workforce that's too divided to fight back. What we need to understand is that the First Republic was never built for all of us. Reconstruction was the attempt to break it. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act was the first attempt to finish the job. But the Republican Party and conservatives never gave up the fight to bring us back to the First Republic. So when they tell you their mythology about they're the party of freedom, understand what they mean. It's freedom for them. It's freedom for the rich, white, wealthy elites. And everyone else's role is to obey. That's the project. That's their fight. And we need to understand it really quickly. And we need to understand that no amount of protest is going to make them understand. We need to recognize that in order to stem the tide and push back, it's going to require us to push back, punch back, and fight back. Thanks for checking out this series on the impact of how the Calais decision was actually set in motion through decades of Republican and conservative capture of media, the courts, and all of the major institutions that we see in day-to-day life. Hope you enjoyed the discussion. Let me know what you think of it in the comments. If you haven't already done so, make sure you subscribe to the show, and that way you'll never miss an episode. Stay tuned for more in the coming weeks.